Hi, everybody, and welcome. Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome so much to the latest Wednesday night edition of the Green Party Live. I'm Heather Thomas, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight's conversation. I am the head of development at the Green Party. And tonight, we're going to be talking about how work is a green issue. One of the phrases that has been emblazoned on so many placards in recent protests has been systems change, not climate change. And that just indicates how so many of the issues that are facing society are actually also green issues, but also how so many issues facing society are interconnected with one another. So this is actually the first of the three-part series in which we are exploring how work, health, and home are all green issues. So our current systems, just as a general intro, why people are gathering into the Zoom room, they tend to confuse the mechanism of the economy, money, with the purpose of the economy, which is to serve all of us, to enable us to have an equitable opportunity for a dignified life. So ensure that we all have the basic access to the right to work, to home, to food, to healthcare. And then on top of it, work is really designed, shouldn't it, or it should be designed, shouldn't it be, to enable us to have connection to people, to place, to meaning, to purpose. And in that, we do believe that work is, of course, the green issue. And when we talk about systems change, shouldn't we be focusing on shifting the economy around so that it isn't a case of people working to feed the economy and feed the economy making money, but shouldn't the economy be something that exists, that is a system that is designed to give us meaning and purpose and to enable us to have, yes, basic security, but then something a bit more fulfilling on top of that. So tonight, we have gathered a group of people together who have actually met last week to have an initial conversation. So this is a continuation of a brainstorm in which we're going to talk about two major issues. So the first and foremost is how do we break down those silos? So if we're talking about systems change, how do we talk about how work being a green issue fits into systems change? How can we look at this in a bit more of a holistic issue? And then the second part of the conversation is how do we get beyond talk? How do we get beyond just talking about work as a green issue as theory? And how do we start practically redesigning work, the nature of work, and yes, talking about jobs that provide equitable access to jobs that are meaningful, give our lives purpose, and help to address some of society's biggest issues. Kind of moving beyond, David Graeber has that concept of bullshit jobs, quote unquote, that's not me swearing, but how do we ensure that we aren't just creating jobs so that we are making money? What are some of those practical solutions? So that's it for me and for the introduction, because it looks like most people are in the Zoom room. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to quickly introduce themselves. I'm going to keep you to 2 minutes each. And I'm going to go alphabetically to be fair. And it would be great if you could introduce yourself because of the topic tonight. Just tell us a little bit about your work and then just really briefly, what motivated you to do that work? So going alphabetically, Alice, I'm going to start with you. Welcome, Alice.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Alice Bordini Staden. I have a finance background, in particular investment management. I started off on the portfolio management side, and then as I've always been a keen hiker and diver, and I observed over the years what changes our natural environment was undergoing. I decided to gradually shift all of the activities that I did towards the environmental finance side. So now my entire focus is on environmental finance and policy. In particular, I work with ClientEarth, and we have here Beth Thoren is our deputy CEO. ClientEarth is an environmental law organization. I will let Beth say a bit more about it. And I am a consultant on sustainable finance and shareholder engagement. I'm also on the National Trust Investment Committee, leading their stewardship and ESG efforts. So essentially, what I do is to work with the finance community to catalyze change at a corporate and to a secondary extent policy level to meet the net zero challenge. This is particularly important in our country because of the stated objective and commitment to be net zero carbon emissions by 2050. I also do some work on the policy side at the House of Commons. I'm on the advisory council of the APPG on sustainable finance, which works with parliamentarians to put together the right set of policy measures to allow and incentivize the finance industry to finance the transition.
Thank you so much, Alice. And after A comes B. Beth, welcome. Could you introduce yourself?
Thanks very much. So I'm Beth Thoren. I'm the Deputy CEO of ClientEarth. ClientEarth is a little organization, agile, very quiet, and we use the law to fight for nature. And we have been quietly, silently, challenging governments on air pollution all across Europe. We've been plant by plant shutting down coal plants in Europe and now in Asia. So it's a pretty effective, agile, and global organization, which I'm very proud to be part of. How did I get here? As a kid, I was in love with the ocean. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And I decided someday I want my life to be on the ocean, and I had no idea how to do it. So but I had no money. So I studied engineering, and I used engineering to get me onto the ocean. And I spent 8 years at sea, traveling around the world. Eventually, I thought, better grow up now. And I went into business, and I spent many years in business, but was a bit frustrated. And I took a sabbatical, joined the radical organization Sea Shepherd, went to Antarctica and saved whales for a little while, and thought, I have to do something for nature. And so I took my business skills and I brought them into nature, and that's how I got here. Thank you.
That's a great story, Beth. Thanks so much. And I think we'll shift to Louis now. Louis, you're at the start of a journey.
Definitely. No, thank you very much for having me as well. Pleasure to be here. So a little bit about myself. So an evolution of a lot of the work that I was doing independently has turned into a brand that I'm now, imminently launching the brand side, but I've been running as a consultancy and training called 7PK, which effectively exists to ensure that people from disadvantaged backgrounds, be they young people, or to be fair, if you'd say young people go up to the age of 30, then you could say young people regardless, can really go about benefiting from opportunities that are going to allow them to fulfill the kind of lives that they actually want to be able to live, by ensuring that in the world of work, by ensuring that in the world of education, there are genuinely opportunities for them to be able to go about experiencing positive social mobility. And then I also co-run a social enterprise called Revolution Hive, where our mission is to equip young people for life beyond the classroom. So we go into schools, colleges, universities, up and down the country, running workshops and programs on personal development, social responsibility, and global citizenship. And so I'm very grateful that with Revolution Hive, in the 4 years we've existed, we've been able to work with around 8,000 young people, running some amazing workshops and programs that have, to this day, we still get lots of young people reaching out saying how much it's impacted them. But I also chair the National Youth Engagement Advisory Group for the Canal and River Trust, which is an organization that manages the canals and waterways in this country, or most of them, let me not say all, but about 200 miles of canals and rivers up and down the country. I chair their Youth Engagement Advisory Group, which brings together youth organizations, that a lot of the big ones, National Youth Agency, Sport England, people like that, to be able to look at how that Canal and River Trust can improve its youth engagement. And I also am a member of something called the 100 Black Men of London, which is a grassroots charity that exists to go about uplifting and empowering the African Caribbean community in London. So quick bit on why. Effectively for me, it's quite simple. I realized that often when you speak to a young person, people say to them, what do you want to do? And I realized that's an issue. We should be asking them, what do you want to design? What do you want to create? Because effectively, they should be the ones that are designing and creating the world that they want to live in. And they must do that in partnership with those that are of elder generations. Yes, but from the fact that we're saying, what do you want to do? We're pigeonholing them into saying that what already exists is what you must fit into. Why should they have to do that if they're going to live in this world longest? So that's the reason as to why I was so rallied up to not only do the work I do, but to join this evening as well.
Very purposeful, and I think everyone's talked about purpose based on their own life experience and how to share that with others as well. So Thanks so much for that, Louis. And last but not least, we'll go to N and we'll go to our peer, Natalie Bennett.
Yes, well, as the introduction said, I'm one of the 2 Green Party members of the House of Lords. And if we think about working on issues around the world of work, I guess if I identify the top 3, I'd say that one of them is universal basic income, which has been a long-term passion of mine that I've also done quite a bit of work in Europe on, because what UBI does is it gives people the opportunity to really choose their work, have the space and the time and the opportunity not to just be forced into the first thing that will make some money that comes along, to maybe start their own small business, to develop an artistic career. So UBI is vital, I think, to choice of work. I also have done a lot of work around the years over the hours we work, and the Green Party's long been championing a 4-day working week with no loss of pay as standard. Although I'm very taken with the New Economics Foundation idea of eventually going down gradually to perhaps a 21-hour working week, a 3-day working week, which was something I was lucky enough to do for a couple of years as deputy editor of the Guardian Weekly, just by accident, because I applied for a job share role. And that allowed me to spend 3 days a week working in my paid role, 3 days a week working for the Green Party as a volunteer. And I actually had a day off, which was a radical concept, which I really enjoyed at the time. And the third thing I'd say that I'm really interested in, that I work in the Lords and elsewhere on the issue of work, is about unpaid work, and the fact that, when we're talking about work, we're very often talking about what's paid. But actually, most of the work that we need doing, the things that need doing, things like caring, are absolutely essential to our society, and many of them are not and never will be remunerated. And that essentially I come to that from a gender perspective, having been a feminist since age 5. And I think since we're talking about work, I was thinking about, what's the worst job I ever did? And I've actually got a few candidates, but I'll name one, which was I was fairly briefly a cleaner. I worked for a contract cleaner, and I used to clean the Coco Cabana nightclub in the Australian city of Wagga Wagga. And since anyone's eating dinner, I won't really describe what exactly that was like. But boy, by the end of the month, before the carpet got cleaned, did they get sticky?
I can imagine. That's brilliant. Thank you, everybody. And talking about people introducing themselves, not just saying what they're doing in life, but just really describing, just in your introductions, how much work can be a sense of meaning, of pride, of purpose. That really came through, because we started already talking about the meat of this evening. We're going to do some question and answers now to carry on the conversation that we had last week, and to help to engage the audience in it. To the audience, I just wanted to ask you to use the Q&A function as we're speaking, because when you use the Q&A function, we can get a sense of upvoting and how many people want a single question to be answered, because we won't have time to answer all the questions. And this way we can answer the ones and get to the ones that the most people want to have answered, so we can be somewhat democratic about it. The first question that we're going to ask tonight is actually going to go back to Natalie. Natalie, just sort of building on the perspective of the Green Party and your work in Lords. I very often heard you say climate justice, environmental justice, and social justice is indivisible. How does this relate to work? You started building on this when you were talking about UBI. Could you explain it a little bit further?
Yes, certainly. And I think I'm going to start with something that many people might remember from a few years ago, which was the horse meat scandal. And one of the things that came out from that was the fact that we in Britain eat twice as many ready meals as the rest of Europe. Now, with the focus on COVID-19 and obesity, and the government and Boris Johnson being something of a convert to obesity strategy, the whole question of diet is something we're coming back to. But if we think about, people often say, oh, diet, I choose my diet. But thinking about what impact work has on your diet, one of the things that we know compared to the rest of Europe, if we can start off with that, thinking about ready meals, is that the UK has the second longest working hours in Europe. It might surprise people to know that Greece is the one with the highest level of working hours. We also have, on average, before COVID at least, on average twice the commuting time as the rest of Europe. And there are so many people in the UK who've been living a life whereby they worked unpaid overtime, maybe, a 10-hour day. They travel 2 hours each way on an overcrowded train, essentially with their face stuck in someone else's armpit, 2 hours each day. And, at 8 p.m. in the evening, they stagger off the bus or the train, and there's this Tesco Metro or Sainsbury's Local or whatever just there by the stop. And you could go home and, slow cook a bit of vegetable stew, but you're not going to do that. Most people aren't going to do that, and that's perfectly reasonable. And so that's a demonstration of the way in which, a really practical demonstration of the way in which the world of work gives us a very unhealthy society, which Britain very much is. And I think the other thing, particularly focusing on the unpaid work issue, I owe this to a wonderful session I did up in Glasgow, with a community group in the poorest area of Glasgow. And someone said something there that really struck me. It was saying, the poorest areas of the UK, people often say, oh, there's a real shortage of work around here. We've got to create some more work. Actually, it's the poorest communities where the things most need doing, where people most need support, where facilities are the worst, where there's issues about, cleaning up public spaces. All of those things are work. The problem is no one's paying for them. And what we saw with that wonderful community group was volunteers saying, we want to volunteer full time, but, we keep being chased by the job centre to apply for 57 jobs a week, even though we know we're not going to get any of them. What we could do is work in our community, do absolutely essential, crucial things, really contribute, really improve people's lives, really contribute to society. But of course, under our current circumstances, that's not essentially allowed. And of course, when the way we count as gross domestic product as a measure of national progress, all of those things don't get counted either. So, work is a major contributor to our unhealthy society. And of course, what lots of us are doing, as our ClientEarth speakers have said, are forced into jobs that are actually trashing the planet, destroying our biodiversity, and also are, as you said, Heather, all too often bullshit jobs, which it's really, bad for your mental health to be doing a job that is really, not contributing, in fact, potentially making the world worse.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Louis, when we met, you talked very eloquently about creating different jobs, different types of work, and you talked a lot about agency. And you talked about the education system, and you talked about how the education system is training young people to go into a lot of these jobs that Natalie was defining or describing, and that there's disquiet amongst young people because they're happy to work and contribute, but they don't want a future where they have to do these jobs where either they know that they're going to be depressed and anxious and making choices that are bad for their personal health and going to work every day, not living their values because they're contributing to things like climate change. So how, Louis, would you, do you think that we need to enable young people to have greater agency and helping them to create the work of the future?
100%. And I think what I'm going to attempt to do in the conversation today is not to solely just think big picture and idealistic, but to really try and ensure that there is some level of practicality. And I think actually I want to credit Alice, because when we spoke last week, that was one of the things we made sure stayed central within the conversation. And I think it was a brilliant point. But effectively, when we're talking about systems change, as all of us would know, when you're looking at trying to create systemic change, you have to get to the point whereby the stakeholders, who are then going to be your agents of change, need to have some form of simple strategy to which they can execute and follow. So in my opinion, if we're going to talk about how we reposition, redefine success as it relates to education, is maybe to consider whether young people are being put in a position by the time they leave education at the age of 18, considering that's the age in which they can, illegally leave education now, whether they are in a position where they feel they can carve a way for themselves in the world that, as we said, does feel meaningful and valuable and stuff like that. So what does that look like? Well, what's interesting is if you do ask young people what's important to them, or more specifically, if we were to get super practical, when you look at this concept of social action that gets spoken about so much within, let's say, the voluntary youth sector, is increasingly being talked about within the education sector as well, and trying to get young people to engage in social action, there are two things that I find interesting. One is that if you ask most young people, what would you want to start some form of social action project around? It's quite interesting how the three main things that come up, and the third of which is obviously due to recent times, are something to do with the environment and climate, something to do with tackling issues around not only mental health amongst young people, but mental health amongst our population, full stop. But then also now you're increasingly getting conversations around being able to tackle racial injustice. And I think a lot of that is due to the amount of energy and attention that was received by the Black Lives Matter movement as of recent. So considering we've got young people who are clearly saying the environment and climate is important to me, being able to tackle issues around mental health is important to me, and being able to increase the level of racial equality that exists in our country is important to me. That already tells us then that we need to go about being able to create opportunities for them to be able to live lives that are in line with those values and allow them to fulfill those priorities, right? So that's one thing. So then what does that look like in practice? Well, effectively, I believe that what if we flipped education on its head and said, as opposed to schools having to go about delivering a curriculum that says, this is what young people need to know, it was actually a case of just facilitating a journey with them for however many years it was to really go about having them understand where they can contribute in the world. So I genuinely believe that there is a lot more scope for schools themselves, if they were given some level of flexibility to not have to just focus on academic success through exams, to work closer with industry. And when I say work closer with industry, I'm not saying, and I don't want to sound like I'm taking a dig here at UTCs, but what I see with some UTCs in the education sector is that they're so focused on just getting young people into jobs in the industry, they're not thinking how do they redefine and transform what that industry looks like. But working closely with industry for the purposes of exposure and experience, because a young person who says, I want to do something about the climate, at what point within their 10 years, 11 years, going on 13 years of school, do they get the opportunity to really understand what a job or work in that space may look like? And also appreciating the balance of the paid and the unpaid. I like what Natalie said, because when I started working in the youth sector, I was volunteering at my local youth club. I helped set up a local youth club in my area. And the area manager for Lewisham Youth Services, who I'm assuming was on a decent salary, said to me, once a volunteer, always a volunteer. And I thought he was mocking me. I thought he was trying to say, you're never going to get a job. And I was like, what does he mean? What does that mean? I'm not worth being paid? He said, no, because you started volunteering now, you're going to volunteer for the rest of your life. And I actually looked at it and I said, I probably give my time away just as much as I get remunerated for my time to this day. And I'm okay with that. And I think there's something beautiful around exposing young people to this concept of our lives being focused on how we contribute to the well-being of ourselves, of others, of the planet, to then have them be able to get to a point where when they reach adulthood, they say, well, actually, this is how I want to craft that life for myself. And then they can actually then engage in agency that's effective. So when they then start to decide they want to do agency, it might be that they seek specific jobs that are going to help to contribute to a well-being economy. It might be that they create jobs through entrepreneurship, through innovation, through cooperative business, which I think is a big one that doesn't often get spoken about, that allows them to then be real agents of change. But effectively, to me, it just comes back down to aspiration, because I think what I find interesting, and I'm going to be a bit biased here towards those from disadvantaged backgrounds, but I definitely think that there's something to be said around when you lack aspiration, you lack the belief that your agency is going to be worthwhile. Mm-hmm. So therefore, you lack even more aspiration. So it becomes a vicious cycle. If we can tackle those two main things of that relationship between aspiration and agency, then I think it solves a number of different issues around how young people become real contributors to our society.
Aspiration and agency. I think that's going to be a little catchphrase from this conversation. Thank you, Louis. I want to move on to Beth now and to build on what you were saying, Louis, about yes, let's do what Alice was reminding us and stay practical about this, because practicality is also a way that people can get their heads around that. It's a thing to do, and a lot of people say hope is an action, right? So Beth, you've been working on helping to instigate something called the National Nature Service. And the National Nature Service, of course, helps to provide services that are needed in a green revolution, from biodiversity enhancement to carbon sequestration, et cetera, et cetera. I'm hoping that you can describe the National Nature Service to us a bit more. Obviously, you know a lot more about it than I do, but could you talk about it also through the lens of what Louis has been talking about? So how is the National Nature Service a framework that can enable people to feel that sense of agency, that can increase people's aspirations? And there was the triumvirate, wasn't there, of environmental improvements and regeneration, mental health improvement, and also if we are creating new lines of work, how do we bake in equitable access to that to help try to address issues of racial injustice? That was a big question, Beth, but why don't you just start with describing the National Nature Service, because I know it does tick most of these boxes.
It does, and maybe let me get to it gradually.
Yeah.
So we know nature's needed help for a long time, but one of the things that COVID has done is put a situation where people need help as well. And the government is in a position where they need to put people back to work. And what we've been saying is actually within the nature sector, and all of the nature charities have gotten together and are aligned behind this, is say, let's put those people back to work restoring nature. We can provide jobs all across the country, rural, urban. We can provide jobs for all. And in particular, we can focus them on young people and disadvantaged people in the most disadvantaged and remote, as well as urban places in the country. And we can do it fast. We have those jobs now. We have a pipeline of projects that need doing. So, you know, we can create easily in 2021, 12,000 jobs. And the bit that's exciting about it is you can start with quite basic jobs. You know, you can be teaching people enough to be recognizing species. You can teach them how to hedge lay. You can teach them how to plant trees. And then bit by bit, you can build their skill levels up so that they can be doing more complicated things, like thinking about when you put in a wetlands, you know, what is the engineering, what's the project management skills that you need to be able to do that? And so it's really exciting because you can get people to work quickly and build their skills over time. Mm-hmm. And it's also really good because we're putting to people in meaningful work. You know, this is people Louis said want to do. We need to plant trees. The government's got a tree strategy. We can put, you know, our rangers to work planting those trees. Flooding is an issue in the UK. Every pound that we invest in flood protection prevents 10 pounds being lost in flood damage. Nature can provide that flood protection. COVID taught us that people are incredibly frustrated not to have nature near them. Again, we can build local parks. The National Trust identified the most deprived nature areas in the country and deprived communities and layered on 155 parks that we could build, and that would provide 2,500 jobs. So it's real meaningful work that will help our economy and help our well-being. And I think, you know, again, getting into where we're going for the future, but, you know, our vision isn't just that the government gives us money and we do these jobs, but we think, how can we transition this to sustainable ongoing jobs? And that's the important bit. And, you know, I think that's done through innovation and smart legislation. There are two really interesting bills going through Parliament at the moment. One is the Agriculture Bill, which has new subsidies in place that will encourage farmers to do the right thing for nature. That will provide jobs. The Environment Bill is putting in place damages such that a developer has to compensate for damage by building alternative habitat. We can build that habitat. And then the last bit, obviously, is entrepreneurship and innovation. And, you know, with smart taxation, the right sort of people, we can be creating more jobs. So the vision is ongoing jobs. And I guess, you know, when I think about, you know, training and how we give people these skills, I mean, Louis and I were talking this afternoon. It was quite an exciting conversation because we're not thinking about, you know, giving somebody a stamp, a qualification. What we're thinking about is giving them real world skills. What transferable skills can you use in any job you would go to? Project management, leadership, team working. Basic environmental skills that you can use. And then lastly, innovation skills. How can we teach you about entrepreneurship? How can we teach you about leadership and accountability? And I think that's a much more interesting area and unique area that the National Nature Service could contribute to, that I think is potentially really, is really exciting. So yeah, we would, you know, the sector would love to create those roles. We need a kickstart investment from the government. And we would love to protect our economy, our well-being, and our future.
That's brilliant, Beth. That addressed the big question very well. I think you hit all of the holistic nails on the head. And And now I just want to transition over to Alice, because we also started to touch on money and flows of money. And whilst money might not be the purpose of life, or earning money might not feel like the purpose of life, getting money flowing where we need money to flow to stimulate the shift in terms of making work greener is going to be essential. Post-COVID, there's going to be huge stimulus that's about to flow. How do we ensure, Alice, that that stimulus actually doesn't just enable a few pilot projects, but that that stimulus comes with conditions that will also enable all of the holistic work that needs to happen to enable this to scale, and to also engage private industry, making private industry and carrying on the investment as well, mitigating the risk. And so making growing things like the National Nature Service, making access to the capital that young people that Louis was talking about with their own enterprise concepts available to them.
Yeah. So the role of the government is absolutely key, and I'm picking up what Beth just said. Private investments typically require a commercial rate of return. And some of the investments, or quite a lot of the investments that are required to meet our climate and environmental crisis, as well as the social crisis, may not typically present, at least to start with, a commercial rate of return. And so we are looking, and not just here in the UK, but governments and capital around the world is looking at governments to provide the initial capital, so to be the catalyst to make it happen. And the reason is that when whoever does the investment first in a new project tends to take the largest risk, because there may be teething issues with that project. There is perhaps a not complete evidence that it's going to work exactly as expected once you do it for the first time. And there's also, very importantly, an uncertainty around the time frame. So if the government steps in and provides this initial investment, will on one side show that the investment works and as intended, and it will give will encourage private capital to follow. And for example, the government could take what we call the first loss. So they say, well, if it doesn't, the return on this project is not what we expect, the government is going to be the first one to give up its share of the return, or the government could provide a guarantee, or even better, could make the investment without requiring a rate of return back. So is absolutely necessary, and the basic premise that for quite a lot of the investments that are required to meet the climate, environmental, and social crisis, the government will make the first investment, and that will be the catalyst. So we're talking about, we say that perhaps for every 20 that the government will commit, there could be another 80 to follow. So it's very, very powerful effect that the government could have. The additional things that the government should do is, and then I'm picking up, it was briefly mentioned by Beth, is to create a clear legal and regulatory framework. It's very important for private capital that you know what the rules of the game are. And these rules are visible and clear, and they don't include unnecessary red tape. It's also very important that there is some support for research and innovation. That is absolutely essential, as well as some fiscal incentives, because why not? If when you're creating an incentive, you have to look at all the various issues that can be relevant for the private sector.
Thanks so much, Alice. That was very comprehensive. I think that one of the things, we started this conversation with talking about how first understanding work is a green issue, then requires understanding practically how to transition the world of work to make it greener and also more meaningful, requires systems change. And thus far in the conversation, we've talked about grassroots community work. We have talked about individual networks of leadership. We've talked about the education system, we've talked about government, we've talked about finance system, we've talked about private enterprise, we've talked about public engagement in work. So I think we've really demonstrated how change does require systems change. And that seems to also require breaking down silos and working more collaboratively. Now that word collaboration is pretty broad. What on earth does that mean? What does that look like on a practical level? I don't think anybody has all of the answers for that yet. But I'm thinking that to enable us to collaborate, we have to have shared goals. And we have to be making sure that all of those different sectors, if we want to call it that, those different interest groups are working around similar goals. So Beth, I'm going to transition in this conversation about collaboration over to you first. And let's just take it back to the National Nature Service to begin with, because it's a nice practical. If we wanted to ensure the National Nature Service was not just a pilot project, but something that could scale, and something that could scale to enable more job creation that was innovative and meaningful, et cetera, what sort of goals do you think we need to coalesce around?
Okay, great. Well, I think I've got 3 goals, and I think the first one is actually we just need to get the government to invest in stimulus for a fairer, cleaner future. And, you know, fair is more equitable, social equity, environmental equity, whatever it is, it's a fairer, greener future. And I don't think there's been enough noise about that. I think the government has just pretty much done what it's wanted to do. And I think we need to stand together to really make the case for what we want. And I think we say we need the stimulus and it needs to be like this. I think the second thing that I think we could coalesce around, you know, if there was appetite for it, is making the National Nature Service real. You know, the nature sector's been working on it. We've had a lot of support from youth organizations, but actually, you know, we need political and public support for the idea. And then also we need advice on how to make it work. You know, we need to be talking to the right government departments and DWP, Cabinet Office, the practicalities of how you deliver it. And then we needed to be talking to young people and people who, you know, experienced working with disadvantaged people to do it well, to sort of do the training well, to do the management well. So the second thing I'd say is help us make the nature service real. Mm-hmm. And I guess the third one is encourage innovation so that we get the kind of jobs that are the jobs that we want. And I think the way you encourage innovation is you have smart legislation, you focus on tax law and some of the things that Alice talked about. And then you also think about training, and you think about, you know, this, you know, what are we actually training people in? You know, is it qualifications and knowledge, or is it skills and abilities? And then, you know, within that sort of framework, you know, some of the stuff that Natalie was talking about, you know, would fit in as well. So I think push the government for a fairer, greener future, help the Nature Service become real, and thirdly, innovate with smart legislation, tax, and smart education.
Thanks a lot, Beth. And as you finished on education, I'm gonna switch to Louis for the next question. So talking about the younger generations. Louis, when we began this conversation, you talked about agency and aspiration. So in terms of investing in innovation, in terms of addressing the crisis of imagination that we potentially have in this country as well, being able to actually visualize that and believe that something like the National Nature Service is possible. What is the role of leadership? When we met, I remember you saying, I just loved it. You were saying something around, we have to make people believe that they can do more. Yes, that requires skilling them up to show them that they can do more, but they have to believe it. So if young people if they want to do something about homelessness in their communities and they go out and they raise £1,000 on a crowdfunder, that's great, but is that enough? We should say that's a great first step. Now, what more can you do? I really liked when you said that. And I'm wondering if you could build on that in terms of ensuring that we are creating the framework and the programs, but then also focusing on leadership that enables people to use that framework to enhance their aspiration. Because it seems if we don't do that, we're not going to be baking in equitable access to new opportunities for everybody.
No, definitely. You make a very good point, Heather. And I think that point I made, what's even more concerning is the fact that I actually said £100. So imagine that you've got people jumping and waving for just 100. And in my head, I'm thinking, but they're capable of so much more. And I think this brings me to a point that sounds a little bit abstract at first, but I mean, I don't know to what extent everybody would agree, but I think to some extent it's worth mentioning the fact that as human beings, we are one of the few organisms that has the opportunity through dignity to decide whether we're going to reach our maximum potential or not. Most other living organisms, it's like, there's no choice. I'm just going to live my maximum potential. This is just what I'm going to do. And so I think what happens is, based on maybe the way that our society is constructed, we maybe then allow for some people to settle for a level far below what they were capable of. And so without then trying to sound abstract solely, let's bring that into practicality then. So what I think is interesting there is when you look at the intersection between the different services and or organizations that a young person may interact with, or even someone in the first, let's say, 10 years of their career may interact with, it's very interesting how sometimes we don't necessarily put people on a path and a journey to help them to understand that they can be those people that are transformational agents within that space or within multiple spaces, because of the fact that we are so used to seeing people exist in one discipline or maybe only be able to achieve so much, and we see anything close to that as normal. So in practice, what I'm saying is, I look at, for example, let's say the voluntary youth sector, where some of the best people I've ever met, some of the greatest professionals I've ever met operate in that sector, you know? However, what I do find interesting is two things mainly. One, even in that sector, their ways of approaching new program design to try and tackle what they deem to be societal issues for young people are still very traditional and lack innovation. So if the people who are providing non-formal education, which is supposed to be a more innovative way of being able to develop young people, are still thinking in a way that, if we're being real, maybe isn't that innovative, then how are we actually going to go about being able to open new doors and new lines of thinking for those young people? But not only that, they tend to only ever speak to people and expose themselves to people from that sector. And I can give you a specific, I was in a meeting earlier on today with a number of different CEOs from organizations across the voluntary youth sector. And I was sitting there going, this is great in terms of you guys wanting to reopen your youth clubs and youth organizations, but like, do you understand there's so many other things that you guys have relevance and can add value to that you're maybe missing? And so talking about where you mentioned leadership, I think this is where sometimes as leaders, we've got to be willing to take bigger risks. And that is the first of all saying, you can do more without feeling like you're putting pressure on those young people. There's a way of framing that interaction and relationship to help them to feel empowered, to say, no, I am capable of more, and I'm going to show the world I'm capable of more. But then there is also the thing about saying to, as leaders, why are we actually doing this? Because what I find interesting is that the common trajectory is that someone will do something in a particular space in order to then get to a point where maybe through status or through particular achievements, which we may or may not even argue whether those indicators of success are good or not, they will do that thing in that space until the point where they're well recognized and win some awards, and then they'll change space and be like, all right, now let me do the thing that's important. For example, go and do something to do with climate. And it's like, well, actually, at what point do we as leaders say, I'm going to take the responsibility of everything? Because if I'm really a leader, how can I ensure that my organization does help to contribute to a better planet, does help to better the environment, does help to improve the fact that, you know, we've got too many people suffering from mental health issues, does all these different things, that you can embed that all into one particular approach. But what it requires you to do is to be able to have conversations with people cross-sector, to find ways to embed very simple strategies so that way you're not waiting to deal with one thing at a time, because unfortunately this needs a multidisciplinary approach in order to be able to provide solutions. And so I think it's also about leaders pushing themselves to say, I as a leader can do a lot more as well, and I need to challenge myself. I always say, if you're working in anything to do with social good, to some extent you're trying to work yourself out of a job. That's what you should be trying to do. So that means you need to be putting pressure on yourself every day to try and make even more impact, you know? So yeah, I think that's the one for me, is about leaders being able to take on more and really start to question whether they're actually looking to fulfill their own potential.
Thank you so much, Louis. It seems to me that we're having quite a conversation about value, so perhaps that's a good segue back to the money aspect of this conversation. We tend to talk, when we're talking about stimulus packages, a lot about how much it's going to cost. But it doesn't seem as though the narrative, at least in the public sphere, focuses on the multipliers and the value that these investments could actually generate. And Alice, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we actually could start to transition the conversation beyond just talking about how much things cost, but talking about the multiplier effect and the value that it can actually create for all of us. And with a little bit of a sidebar, I mean, we know how value as far as future cash flows is defined right now. But given that we're talking about value in the world of work in a more holistic sense, I'm wondering if you think some of those measures of value need to be changed or evolved.
Yeah, sure. So when the government assesses investments, the government has the luxury and the prerogative of making investments for an infinite time frame. And so there is, even in circumstances where, for example, the well-being of its people is difficult to attribute a monetary value, then there should be a much stronger case compared to private finance to support that kind of investments. But if we go back to just considering the issue of value and investments and how you make it happen and how you can translate it into, by the multiplier effect, into a benefit for the entire society, we go back to the issue of data and metrics. And unfortunately, the way finance works is that it's driven by numbers. So I've done a lot of work on financial strategies, on trying to define financial strategies to protect biodiversity and our natural capital. And it boils down to the issue of data. So how do you give a value to, for example, biodiversity or biodiversity loss, or more importantly and in a relevant way to this webinar today, to ecosystem services, which are all the direct indirect contributions of the ecosystem, the natural capital, to human well-being. So they're much harder to define. Not just human well-being, but also the entire ecosystem and how our natural environment works. So, for example, the role the bees have for natural pollination, that is an ecosystem service. And the use of pesticides that kills bees then has this indirect effects as well. And how do you price it? So the way I see it from a finance perspective is that externalities now are not priced. And what externalities are, just briefly, are the consequences of an industrial or commercial activity which affects other parties. And the first externality that we are all very familiar with is pollution. So companies can just pollute the waters, the air, and they're not paying for it. And this is creating this unsustainable system we're in, where for as long as essentially companies, but whoever interacts with the environment and creates with this negative externalities is not charged and doesn't pay for it, it kind of harder. So I would see personally as the easiest and fairest way to everyone to invest and create this multiplier effect that you say and create real value is just to start charging for externalities. So there should be a price for carbon emissions. Now there is obviously an attempt at the European level. Europe is the one at a global scale is more advanced in dealing with the climate issue. And with climate, it's easier because now we have a metric that's carbon emissions, and that is a proxy for climate risk. And so there should be a fair price for carbon emissions. The carbon trading scheme now is just not fairly priced. It's way too cheap. You know, companies that pollute more should pay a lot more to pollute our environment. But then equally, the same should be applied to polluting our water streams and polluting our oceans and destroying biodiversity. So I think that this would really make a huge amount of difference to our well-being and ultimately survival. So I know I'm not giving you an answer. There are some various initiatives around the world trying to come up with a valuation framework for ecosystem services and biodiversity. Unfortunately, until we have one framework that is agreed and standardized, you kind of struggle to make real progress, because you're always going to have, you know, the counter arguments that this is not fair. And so we should ideally be get to, for as far as the social value and environment other environmental damage, to where we are with the climate, and that we're very clear what we're aiming for, and it's net zero carbon emissions for 2050. So yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alice. And it's quite clear that one of the issues is we don't have consensus yet around those valuation tools, and that's difficult, but clearly bringing externalities onto the balance sheet is a way to start. So at least in the language of numbers, it's not that we can put a price on the value of life. That's not what anyone I hear is suggesting, at least in terms of what I'm hearing. But how do we use the language of numbers to be able to create some consensus around how we're making the best possible decisions to be able to create work that is truly green. And with that, I'm just aware of time, and I'm going to go to a question from the audience. And Natalie, you were the person I was coming to next, but I think this is a pretty holistic question that's been upvoted, so I'm going to address it to you if that's all right. Howard has asked, with so many people working from home and likely never to return to an office, what advice do you give people working from home to ensure their environment is green? I think that might mean the working environment. And I think this really connects back to where we left the conversation. What demands should employees be putting on their employers regarding this new situation to make sure that work is more holistically greener?
Well, thank you very much, Howard, for that. And I think this is something that so many people are really wrestling with at the moment. And, you know, there's two sides to the whole working from home thing. I saw a tweet was directed at me earlier today with someone who was saying, you know, they're saving hundreds of pounds a month in commuting costs. They're getting, you know, at least sort of 3 hours a day more at home, so it's more time with the children. Oh, but they said, oh, but we're starting an extra hour a day, so my boss is getting an extra hour a day of work out of me too. So, you know, it's a win-win for the boss. And, you know, I'd like to really intervene at that point and say, you know, I want you to gain that time, but I don't think there's any reason why the boss should be gaining, you know, that extra hour could be more time for you with your family, or perhaps even, you know, more time doing community things, getting involved in your community. You know, even dare I say, you know, coming on a Zoom call like this, I've got a saying often that politics should be what you do, not have done to you. But, you know, I often say that to audiences who, you know, you see the whole room or the whole Zoom call, everyone sort of goes, yeah, but where am I going to find the time? And that time is a huge value, and, you know, to give it to your boss for nothing. And, you know, of course, lots of people are very worried about redundancies, about the future of their job. And I think there's been some discussion there, is, you know, we need a situation, and the Green Party's long been championing, you know, strong trade unions, people getting together, fighting for each other. And, you know, our Young Greens in particular do a huge amount of work of encouraging people to join a union. And we know, I mean, I've worked in Sheffield with Sheffield Needs a Pay Rise, you know, that they talk about, you know, very often encountering young people who don't even know what a union is. That's part of the story. What I was talking about with UBI also means that we have, you know, if people have the ability to say no to a boss, then that really creates much more power. And I'm often asked about, in terms of a UBI society, what potentially might it be like? And, you know, how will you get people to do the really horrible jobs if they don't have to do that, if they could, you know, not necessarily comfortably, but live on a UBI. And, you know, my answer to that is, you know, maybe if we think of sewer cleaners, for example, which most of us probably wouldn't perhaps fancy, you know, maybe you'd have to pay the sewer cleaners a lot more if people have the choice to withhold their labour. Maybe you pay the sewer cleaners more than the bankers. Maybe you should pay the sewer cleaners more than the bankers. So we need to, when we're thinking about working from home, make sure that there is no reason why extra benefits should go to employers when we've already got, as I started, we're being nicely circular here. I started by talking about having the second longest working hours in Europe. We have a real problem. We have a huge problem also with wage share. The amount of money from the economy that's going into people's wages has massively fallen over the past decades. That's associated with 0 hours contracts, minimum wage, the repressive trade union legislation, which has happened under a whole range of successive governments. We need to empower people. Sometimes that's through unions, sometimes that's through ensuring that people have sources to access to enough money no matter what. And just to finish on the comment that Alice made about having to put, the way I'd put it is, have to put the real price of goods on the price tag. Well, that means people have to be able to pay that price. And, if you've got a job interview on Monday and you really need a nice, clean, crisp white t-shirt for that, and all you've got is £5 in your pocket, if you go to Primark and buy the £5 t-shirt there, even though there's huge externalized costs on that, the only thing I'm going to say to you personally is good luck in your job interview. But we have to create a society where people can afford to pay the real price of that t-shirt.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think that's a great segue to a question that Mano has asked that a lot of people have seconded. And that is, what are some of the best role models for creating greener work out there? Which countries or which companies have really inspired you? Beth, I'm wondering if it's fair to address that to you. I'm assuming that there was probably some inspiration behind the National Nature Service. Would you like to start?
Yeah, the National Nature Service, I think we have the 1930s and Roosevelt to thank for that, because, that's what turned around the US after the Great Depression, was putting all these young people into work in nature. So Roosevelt is one. I think another, other countries that are doing it well are New Zealand, unsurprisingly, and Australia. They both have put in place national nature services. I think a lot of countries around the world are looking very actively at green stimulus. You'd be interested to know that China is actually very actively engaged at looking at stimulus and how to do that right and in a green way. So I think there's lots of positive places in the world to look. And in terms of companies, I'm a big fan of Patagonia, and they're in business to save the world. And every time I come across them, that seems to be very true.
Thanks, Beth. And I think I'm going to ask Louis to answer the same question. In particular, given all of the work that you do with social enterprises, are there some models out there that I know Patagonia too, and I've read the book, I love it. But are there some other companies out there that people might not know that they should?
I think there are a number of companies that are doing great work that people might not know. I think making it specifically just to the climate could be challenging. I think the key thing that I wanted to draw out of that question, though, specifically, was more importantly some of the models that some of those companies are being able to use, and then thinking about how that relates to our day-to-day experience, because I think this is a perfect question to combine this concept of not only what we may consume, but also how our consumption can then lead to contribution. And I think for me, the best social enterprises that I see that are contributing well to the climate emergency are those that are really thinking deeply about localizing their supply chains, thinking deeply about how they can go about being able to not only provide employment to those from particular localities, but also really considering how they can then go about working with other businesses that are ethical and sustainable and stuff like that. And even when at times that may affect their ability to create brilliant profit margins. And I think these are the kinds of things that, any person who's looking for that moral incentive will then be able to, seek that as an option. But also there are times when those businesses and organizations have been able to do that really well. And it's also added to that economic incentive. And I feel like I'm about to start quoting the 3 incentives from Freakonomics. And I know some people don't always necessarily take well to that particular book on incentives, but regardless, I think when you can consider how some of them are addressing the economic, social and moral incentive effectively, then there's definitely some hope that exists. And I know hope is not action, but they're taking the action. So yeah.
That's brilliant, Louis. Thank you so much. I'm just going to take one last question. I hope that's okay, because I think there's a question that I would like to address to Alice. A lot of people are talking about donut economics, Kate Rayworth, and creating an economic structure that fits within the resources that nature allows, and then distributes that to as many people as possible. And there's a really specific question that talks about GDP. Is it, how do we move away from GDP being our universal measure to something like gross national happiness? Is that viable?
So, yes, the trouble with the current system is, and this is exemplified, this is a really good question, because is a capitalist system that is based on the creation of money. And the creation of money can be proxied with GDP growth. And so there is this everlasting quest from governments around the world and all sorts of economic actors to look at the GDP, and the GDP should be going up. And if the GDP is not going up, then it means we are in a recession and the things are really bad. And of course, what we also know is that infinite GDP growth is just not compatible with the finite resources of our planet. And so what would really make the system change is this a systemic shift in people's quest and government's quest for sustained and infinite growth, because we are already almost at capacity of our planet's resources in terms of the air, the water, so everything, the climate. You know, we already probably even beyond, and so how do we move away from obsession about growth and perhaps accepting that, you know, our economic conditions per se can't continue growing forever as a community, but there are the other wealth, that is our well-being, and that is our own, the more, let's say, non-monetary values that we have, and you know, happiness, and you know, being close to nature, and being closer as a community. That would be the path to actually moving towards a sustainable future. How do we get there? It's not easy, because there is still this obsession, and it's not just governments. This is how our economic system works, that you're constantly trying to enrich yourself. You're constantly trying to make more money, because now you know, the overall accepted system is, if I have more money, I can buy more things. You know, but we're already at the point where we have all the things that we need. And but there are certain other things that we don't have access to anymore. As you know, Beth was saying, you know, access to parks, and access to nature, and you know, butterflies are not around, and they used to be around when we were kids. You know, things like that. And without even talking about the consequences of severe climate disruptions, which if we don't stop, they will come, and they will obviously impact large swathes of the population in a very, very dramatic way.
Thank you so much, Alice. It is almost 7:05, so we asked you for an hour of your time and we've gone over. So I'm going to say an enormous thank you to everybody tonight. I think, at least from my perspective, we've done a really good job of talking about how no one has all of no one person, no one organization can possibly have all of the answers for how we change systems. and a lot of the solutions are still emerging. And it's this fine balance of continuing to break down silos, finding means by which to talk about issues, to develop new insights from the perspective of different sectors, different pieces of work, different perspectives of people living in different parts of the country with different experiences in life. And it's blending that with developing new practical solutions and making sure that we have the freedom to develop those solutions, to be imaginative, to be innovative, to try new things, to fail, and to just continuously get better. And somehow figure out how to do this with extreme urgency, because we haven't got that much time, either from the perspective of the environment or from the perspective of people who have been marginalized and they are done being marginalized. That has to change. So thank you everybody for your perspectives and for your time. And to the audience, thank you so much for all of your contributions, and a reminder that we are embarking upon 2 months of a project that we're calling Better is Possible. And we're trying to highlight how better is possible, but also highlight how better is already happening. That's why we know better is possible. So this is a first conversation about how work is a green issue. There will be more to come. The next conversation that we're going to be having is next Wednesday at 6 o'clock. And that will be focused not on how work is a green issue, but on how health is a green issue. But we've already touched on it tonight. Health and work are also interconnected. So we're going to keep building on that theme of interconnections and how we can build holistic solutions. So I will leave it at that for tonight. Thank you everyone so much, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.